The Declaration of Human Rights after the Second World War, food belongs to the essence of standard of living. I think it's Article 25 of the Declaration. And you could say this declaration and all that belongs to it is part and parcel of the DNA of the city of The Hague, an international city of peace and justice with a lot of UN and EU institutions within the city, apart from international business and important research institutes like the Hague Institute for Global Justice.
Well, we recognize that the right to food is a contested topic, a contested subject. But I think that these three perspectives, conflict prevention, the rule of law, and global governance, will help to elucidate the challenge, and which will be very useful. Clearly, the role of the City of The Hague is emblematic, I think, of the fact that this challenge is not going to be met successfully by only governments. You need a variety of stakeholders, and cities will have a very important role to play in meeting this challenge. So we're very hopeful. And it's also important that one would have measurable indicators to track progress and hold various stakeholders to account. And one has to be able to find the right moment, because timing is critical, in which to make a difference. And we, of course, at the Hague Institute for Global Justice, as a think and a do tank, will do our part, both through the policy-relevant research which we conduct on this topic and on related issues, in the kind of convening that we're doing with this dialogue in cooperation with the city. And of course, as part of our training activities, it is a tremendous privilege and an honor to play a role in this endeavor and to organize this dialogue in cooperation with the municipality of The Hague.
Food often is grown in places where people aren't. People are moving increasingly to cities. In doing so, they move from being producers of food to consumers of food, and that is also putting enormous pressure on food systems, on food security overall.
Cities play an important role in the global food system, especially, of course, because they're consuming spaces, consumption spaces. But increasingly, they can also play a role in production. That goes for the global north, for the city of The Hague, for example, but that also goes for southern cities.
Well, I think an absolutely prerequisite is that the government and the city, and maybe those in the city, like institutions here, would be of the same view. It doesn't help if an institution says you can come here and do some mediation if the government turns a blind eye. Of course, the city has always been very supportive, and I would like to see them supportive in this chapter as well. And if you say, well, how? I think we should just design or dedicate a sort of Camp David house. We should have a place where people would come. You would need to set up an infrastructure, and that infrastructure would have to be such that it is secluded from the rest of the world so that nobody can come and look in, and that parties will feel at ease to have their conversations. So I think we should just buy a hotel and start working.
I think there are a variety of different levels. One can begin at the local level, obviously, with local governments and who are the closest to the people, to make sure that there's farming that takes place, that the food is grown, that people have the capability of getting the food. Then I think parliaments have a responsibility to make sure, again, that there's equity and a way that food is shared, that there is security for water, fertilizers, the various seeds that are necessary for producing the food, that people are able to own the land so that they can grow the food. And then the international community, I think, also has a responsibility. There is the Food and Agricultural Organization, which is a United Nations agency, to make sure that food is available and distributed.
In the Netherlands, we often talk about the Dutch diamond, the diamond of the deck of cards. Its four corners consist of the private sector, the public sector, civil society, and science, and they all have a role to play in addressing this challenge, and that has to do, as I said, with rights, with responsibilities, but also with the distinct roles that one can play to do this. As I said, the Dutch diamond. First of all, you have to sit together at one table and look each other in the eyes and say, hey, what can you contribute to tackle this? And but also respect each other's roles and each other's interests.
They are small things that governments can take, not necessarily at a national level, at a local level, at a municipal level. These are the agents that can really make a difference and ensure that food gets to where it needs to get, and that people have, it's not a privilege, it's a right, the access to food.
A different food system is possible. It is possible if we build on people's capabilities, if we give them a voice in decision-making at all levels, if we strengthen people's rights to natural resources, water, but also women's rights that are so fundamental to achieving a better food system and the right to food. And if we also look seriously at our own consumption level, if we look at our consumption as consumers, our action as citizens, our policies as governments, and to seriously take into account the impacts of those anywhere across the world.
In certain instances, there are artificial, I think we can say, impediments to these things. Some of these are related to national governments and the inability or perhaps unwillingness even of these countries to really push the agenda of food security, to really ensure that even the poorest citizens do get food. We in South Africa do have a national school feeding scheme, for example, which is an enormous contributor to food security, particularly in early age, but that has to carry on, obviously, through a lifetime.
Well, I must say, I look forward to the day that a case involving food will be brought before one of the institutions. Indeed, the Peace Palace is the place where international disputes can be settled. Personally, I see far more in a system of mediation which does not call for a legal conflict to be construed, but where the two parties could sit together, maybe with the help of a third party, and to hammer out the problem and to come to a solution.
The world has come to the point now where we are extremely rich in aggregate. We have a tremendous amount of global income. We have an even more amazing amount of global wealth. The problem really is the distribution of these two. So if you think about income for a moment, the income in the world is so unevenly distributed that the lower half, the poorer half of the human population, has a little bit more than 4% of global household income. If they had 6%, the great human rights relevant deprivations of this era, including lack of adequate nutrition, could be solved. That would be enough, right? A little bit more purchasing power to the poor would shift production into producing more food for poor people and would solve that problem.
I posed the question of how you should look at the right to food as a human right. And then I made a distinction between the rights which are clearly individual rights, and these are more, I would say, general themes where the government has to act, where maybe the individual has a right, but it's a different right from the right to free speech or the right to being left alone in your beliefs. So I'm a bit hesitant to talk about a rights-funded approach or a rights-based approach for the right to food. You cannot expect a government to sort of distribute the food to the population just because there is a right to food. I think that the right to food has to be seen in the context of a group of social, economical rights, like the right to housing, or the right to a proper health, or the right to a decent environment. These are all quality of life aspects that you can frame as a right, but which basically entail an obligation of the state to work for it. It is a right which is more a collective right than an individual right. It is not a right that you can, as a person, go to a court to, but maybe as a society or as a group, you might call for its application.
To take a human rights approach to food, it's important because you put people central in the discussion. You put small-scale farmers, you put consumers central in the discussion on food.
The right to food has shown to be a very effective approach, also in the work of NGOs. As ActionAid, we support women, communities, smallholder farmers in achieving their right to food in a way that is empowering, that ensures their control over the natural resources, and for them to hold their own governments, local governments, national governments to account.
So I think the most important issue with regard to the right to food is that we get an accurate measure of what the problem really is, where the world now stands with regard to the right to food. And unfortunately, I have to say that the organization that is charged with answering that question, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, is not doing a good job in informing us of where we stand.
I think it is such a basic right that people forget that huge numbers of people in the world are starving. I think that what is happening is that there's more and more cognizance of the fact that countries are divided into two parts, some where people have not enough to eat and others where diet books are bestsellers. And I think it's absolutely essential that we understand how many people are starving, even if it's not used as a weapon of war, but starving because of the environmental situations that are going on, desertification, not enough way that people can irrigate their crops. And then there are all kinds of issues to do with distribution, which has a lot to do with infrastructure. And the cities have a big part that they can play in making sure that their populations are fed.
Through public mobilization, through people being aware of these things, we start to get public action around addressing them. So, one of the first steps we need to ensure is that everybody is aware that food security is a concern. It's a concern now, today. It's going to be a greater concern in the future, particularly with population growth and climate change, combination of those two. So, public awareness is obviously there.
On a general note, I think that the world should come to terms with new technologies. I've been part of many discussions in our part of the world about the introduction of new technologies, notably the genetic manipulation of foods. The word manipulation was not felt to be correct, but everybody knows what it means, a GMO food, which are seen as a sort of Frankenstein food in our part of the world. But they may solve issues of the right to food in other parts of the world, because it may make the food more abundant and it may overcome issues of pests that would otherwise ravage the crops. So that, in my view, is an important element. The application of the new technologies in the agriculture, in the food production in countries of the third world. And we, of course, live on a different planet. We think that we can do without, and we would rather do without because we are not so sure about the consequences on the long term, which is a very valid point. But in looking at the question whether you prefer, say, starvation to being fed with foods which are excellent, but of which you do not know the long-term consequences, I think my money would be on the last one.
Beyond the production of food, there's an enormous challenge around the distribution and the utilization of food. But there are also a number of impediments even to getting existing food to where it is needed most.
When it comes to food production, the players are cross-sectoral. It's not only the producer or the consumer, but along the chains between them, there are so many players. So how do we facilitate everyone to be fully integrated into the system? That's really important, but sometimes it's broken somewhere. And this era, sometimes like in developing countries, when you look at it, the future is strong involvement of local private sector into the system. But sometimes these private sector people, they don't get information. They don't have access to user-friendly loans or lending systems that can help them to be active players. They don't have enough capacity probably, so how do we bridge all of those together to build a vibrant local private sector? I find it a critical thing to be working on to make sure that the food system is all complete.
Many projects and people who are working on the projects and programs don't know where the funding is. So how can we link those people towards the funding which is there? So that's a mechanism which can help people, and especially companies or groups or organizations, to work together on the ground with funding from Europe, from the United States, from foundations all over the world. And that's also joining forces. That's matchmaking.
So people, they need to have information, but also for certain countries, the access to infrastructure is a huge issue. So how do we make sure that people are linked, but also there is accessible financing way of people to be able to be clear, smart, key players into this? That also need to be stressed so that people can see that there is a possibility of bridging the gaps in food systems instead of just one sitting in his own corner and another one there.
Overall, we cannot neglect that most of the conservation and adaptation work continues to be done by farmers in their fields, and we need to make sure that the legal framework facilitates the rights that the international treaty has already recognized.
And we know that we are able to, by natural breeding, develop the plants that can stand higher temperature or higher salinity or a more unpredictable weather, a new pest, a new disease, almost whatever it is. So if we are just able to utilize this fabulous diversity, this tremendously important global common good that crop diversity is, we believe it is possible to deal with this dual challenge of population growth and climate change?
The right to food is toch afhankelijk van de right to seed. Dus in hoeverre kunnen die miljoenen boeren en tuinders over de hele wereld toegang hebben tot het beste zaad en de beste planten die te krijgen zijn tegen acceptabele voorwaarden. En op dit moment kennen we de situatie met kwekersrecht. En dat kwekersrecht heeft er de laatste decennia voor gezorgd dat de innovatie in rassen enorm snel is gegaan. Dus die innovatie die hoeft niet geborgd te worden met octrooirecht. Dat gebeurt met kwekersrecht uitstekend. Als octrooirecht doorzet en over een aantal decennia de eigenschappen van planten toch in handen zijn van enkele bedrijven wereldwijd, dan kunnen zij in feite het inkomen van boeren en tuinders en daarmee ook de voedselvoorziening in de wereld sturen. En dat lijkt ons geen gewenste situatie.
Because in Europe we have the biotech directive, the European Biotech Directive, and it regulates all the biotech innovation, so including the medical innovation, the industrial innovation, and of course the agro-food innovations. And if you are going to change this directive, this will affect the whole biotech industry. So also the companies who are working on diseases, orphan diseases, and so on. It will give an insecurity or an insecure situation for maybe 10 or 15 years. And that will have a devastating impact on the biotech industry as a whole. On the other hand, if you look at tomatoes and lettuce, which are the crops that has the most patents around it, what we see there is an enormous innovation. If I go to the supermarket in the afternoon, I've never seen so many tomatoes and so many lettuce.
Another thing I would like to see changed in the legislation at the European level is the seed marketing directives. The current seed marketing regulation is really hindering the marketing of diverse seeds. It's favoring the marketing of uniform, stable seeds that can be easily reproduced and easily grown on large-scale farms, and those seeds can be protected by intellectual property rights. So it's really not allowed to market all kinds of diverse seeds. If they don't meet the criteria, then you are not allowed to market them. You can still grow them by yourself, but as soon as you put them on the market, it's not allowed.
I think the perspective of conflict prevention will be important in looking at good governance, at the role of cities, and how good governance at this level can help to prevent the origin and the escalation of deadly conflict, which is a major issue. And this perspective, I think, more broadly, we have found that conflict prevention is more effective than trying to come up with a solution after conflict has actually erupted. The perspective of the rule of law, as the title of this dialogue implies, is grounded firmly on a rights-based perspective. And the rule of law will be critical in trying to understand how one can build up a framework of rights and actually implement those rights. And when we look at global governance, this is also critical in helping to fulfill what the Sustainable Development Goals, the new goals, emphasize so rightly, the importance of having a multi-stakeholder approach to dealing with these problems. And of course, this Sustainable Development Goal number 2 really emphasizes the importance of food security and how you would need a multi-stakeholder approach, an approach not only of governments but of cities to meet this challenge. So I think all three perspectives will be critical.
I think that the fact that starving people is a weapon of war in Syria is an example of how people need the right to food. It is a basic human right, and the fact that it is then removed in order to punish people and to make them suffer as a result of governmental decisions is part of the problem that the international community has to deal with. It is the responsibility of a head of state to take care of his or her people, and feeding them is a very basic aspect. And so the right to food is something that we all need to look at as part of our international responsibilities.
When we speak about food losses, when we speak about food security, it's very much related to security and peace. Because what we have seen in many countries 10 decades ago is that there is no food, you have conflicts and you have wars. So I have to combine not only looking to the conflicts and wars, but especially also how can we secure food for so many people worldwide.
The climate threat is also a very massive threat to the right to food, because very large areas of our planet will become arid, will become very difficult to grow anything on. And so food prices will rise as a consequence. And of course, as usual, the rich will outbid the poor for the scarce food resources. The rich will get flowers, the rich will get biofuels, and so forth, while the poor will not even have enough to feed their children and meet their very basic food needs.
It is particularly important that we also look at our footprint globally. There is an increasing pressure on natural resources that is affecting vulnerable groups in southern countries primarily, but globally, also in cities in the north. There is climate change, environmental degradation happening as a result of increasing pressure, and with growing demand for food and other commodities, it will be important that we take that seriously, take that question of consumption and our global footprint seriously.
The main challenge, of course, is to ensure we produce enough food in the first instance. And in order to do so, we've got to be responsive to the climate change that obviously is happening. And we have to assist farmers to become more adaptable. We have to assist farmers to become more resilient. And in that way to ensure that we do indeed produce a lot more food.
I think the most pressing issues have to do with what is going on in climate change. Because more and more land is not available for farming because the arid conditions, or people do not have access to water, to irrigation, and the problems that happen in terms of weather generally. So I do think that as we deal with environmental problems, we are clearly also dealing with the food issue.